Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out to our first event of the new Federalist Society season we have going here. This is our first event of kind of our fall season. Next month, we can look forward to our Supreme Court review, which we expect to have near the end of the month. And we may have another special event in between now and then, so please stay tuned to your email, and we'll let you know about all of that. I should introduce our new officers for the 2010-2011 year. My name is Jacob Huber. I'm the president. Joe McCandlish is our vice president this year. Eric Murphy is our treasurer. And our speaker, Maurice Thompson, is our secretary. We have a lot to cover on the federal health care mandate, so I think we can get right to it. I'll introduce our speakers briefly. Maurice Thompson will go first. He's the executive director of the 1851 Center here in Columbus, which is a libertarian public interest law firm that brings suits in defense of limited government and individual rights. And Professor Dan Coble is professor of law at Capital Law School. So I'll invite Maurice to come up and go ahead first.
Maurice Thompson. There's really a fair amount of ground to cover here, so I'll try to get right down to it. And can everybody hear me all right? Mm-hmm. Good. First, a little bit of background before we get into the real substance of the arguments. I want to talk about, for those of you who aren't entirely aware, what exactly happened here, what we have before us, what the actual statute at issue is. This is the mandate that we're talking about today, which is the requirement that all Americans, except for the Amish and the Scientologists, purchase minimum essential coverage, which will be defined later by the Department of Health and Human Services, by some bureaucrats as whatever they decide that will be. And that entails part of the policy problem. So just a few quick points about the policy and the constitutional background here. Why do we care about the individual mandate? Lots of people think it's a great idea that everybody should have health insurance. Well, we care about it for constitutional reasons that we get to, but we also care about it for policy reasons, and we also care about it for moral reasons. One concern, most Federalists, most people who believe in federalism, believe that the states should serve as laboratories for experiment. Well, the idea of mandating health insurance has been deliberately rejected by every state except for one, Massachusetts, up until this time. And where that experiment has occurred in Massachusetts, it has failed horribly. Health insurance premiums increase at about 12% per year, which is the highest in the country since the mandate was implemented. Healthcare spending is up over 25%, and most people that weren't insured then still are not insured now. So it makes sense that other states should be able to take account of that fact and then decide for themselves whether or not to implement an individual mandate. And we care about it for moral reasons. Many people have a problem with the notion that the government should compel you to do something merely because you exist. We are concerned about it because of the slippery slope. If they can compel you to do this, what else can they compel you to do? And a little constitutional background that helps explain this. Our initial inclination is there must be a right to be free from such compulsion, and that may have been true at one time. That may have been true under a substantive due process. That may have one time been true under the Privileges and Immunities Clause, or perhaps even the Ninth Amendment. However, that ship has long since sailed, unfortunately, and the repudiation of those rights really occurred during the New Deal era, in which, after Franklin Delano Roosevelt switched in time to save 9, threat to pack the court, we saw a dramatic shift in constitutional jurisprudence, whereby the General Welfare Clause was turned into something that limited Congress's authority to enact legislation for all, for the benefit of all, to something that instead empowered Congress to do whatever it wanted, where in Nebula and Caroline products, economic rights were very much put on the back burner, given a second-class citizenship in the specter of rights. And of course, Wicker v. Filburn in the early 1940s, where essentially amongst the several states portion of the Commerce Clause was permanently eviscerated to, again, be revisited, and the same essentially done in Gonzales v. Raich. So at one time, the Constitution was perhaps a sturdy ship, the mighty haul, and now it's a shipwreck. And we as conservatives and libertarians are kind of adrift in the ocean and looking for a big piece of wood to climb up onto and perhaps float safely to shore. And that's what constitutional jurisprudence is for us these days. Make no bones about that. With that said, there's not necessarily a sense of desperation in the argument against the mandate. There are very legitimate arguments against it. When we're looking at whether the government can do something, it's a two-step process. One, is there a power? Two, if there is a power, is there nevertheless an individual right that protects us from that power? The arguments are essentially that there are two powers here. One is the taxing power, one is the commerce power. The taxing power is something that was talked about a little bit in the debate by law professors, but not at all by politicians. It's often argued by the other side that the only limit on the taxing power is the political process. Of course, there should be some chagrin amongst all of us there because, as we know, during the political process, as this bill was being debated, it was explicitly noted by the President, by the Speaker of the House, and by the President of the Senate that this is not a tax. The promise was this is not a tax, this is not a tax. So how is the political process to limit the implementation of a tax when the politicians are lying to you and telling you it's not a tax so that you don't know enough to oppose it in the first place? Nevertheless, there are real limits on the taxing power, and there are two that are worth noting. One is the definition of a tax itself. Of course, this has to qualify. The individual mandate requires you to purchase minimum essential coverage and then sanctions you if you do not. The definition of a tax is something the Supreme Court of the United States has called a pecuniary burden laid upon individuals or property for the purpose of supporting the government. Here what we have is a regulation of behavior. Here what we have is a forcible transfer of wealth from individuals to private insurance companies, not for the support of the government. And in fact, if the mandate is successful, if it forces everybody to buy health insurance, well, then guess what? It raises zero revenue. It's not a revenue-raising statute in and of itself if it works the way that the government anticipates that it will work. Aside from the definition, it's also important to note that there is Supreme Court precedent indicating that the purpose of the tax can't be to regulate behavior. It must first and foremost be to raise revenue. Of course, if it secondarily regulates behavior, that's considered okay. However, that can't be the primary purpose. Here, it seems clear, everybody acknowledges the findings in the statute itself, acknowledge the purpose of this is to regulate behavior, to incentivize people to purchase insurance. So I think that the tax argument will ultimately be found to be unsuccessful, and this really will come down to the Commerce Clause, if not to substantive due process or individual rights. So when we look at the Commerce Clause, and I think this is consistent, by the way, with the Virginia decision. For those of you who weren't aware, last week the District Court, Eastern District of Virginia, decided that denied the government's 12b6 motion to dismiss, which argued standing. I'm not really going to get into standing, maybe in the question and answers. It's kind of an interesting issue. And really, most of its analysis took place in the scope of the Commerce Clause. Now, when we look at the original meaning of the Commerce Clause, it's important to remember what it was there for. We had the Articles of Confederation. We had states enacting tariffs against each other, and some people wanted a free trade zone, and those people ultimately won out, and we got a Constitution, and we got a Commerce Clause specifically to enable a free trade zone amongst the entire country. And the Supreme Court has recognized that fact. That's not a, some sort of libertarian utopian argument. So the original purpose, obviously, we've strayed a bit from that. We look at the language of the Commerce Clause, and it says Congress can regulate commerce amongst the several states. So we have a three-pronged analysis. It has to be regulation. That means just to make regular. It's typically never an issue. It has to be commerce, and it has to be amongst the several states. Well,